public sphere and make it acceptable, make it part of the law, which is then enforceable and so on. So what Biden says is, you know, this is my private thing, and I confess that, but I don't want to impose it on anybody. So he does not want to enter it into the legislative process so that it becomes an enforceable law, because moral laws cannot be enforced. They can be enforced only if they're transformed into positive law, if they are posited by Congress or, you know, by a state legislature or whatever. So, but these are good examples now. They become very tricky there, you know, in what the Democratic Party says and the other party says and so on. And so the religious people have to, Biden did not think that he could make an argument which the majority of Americans would understand any longer. And the reason is, you know, the American public has no natural law. The Stoic natural law of the Catholic Church has been abandoned. We do not even have the bourgeois natural law anymore, which to the French Revolution was transformed. We have a purely positivistic administration of justice. That means only those laws which are made by the states or by the federation are binding. Everything else is private morality. So you still can introduce, you know, the thing against abortion and so on, but you have to make this clear now, you know, so that it is plausible to people who do not believe any longer. And it's not only belief, it's the whole culture has changed. That means we do not understand Aristotle anymore. We do not understand Plato anymore, because we are not Platonists, not Aristotelians, we are nominalists. See, the concepts are not real for us. They are only forms in our head by which we order things outside. So if somebody acts as if human nature, you know, was something real and not something in our head, the majority in the public sphere will not understand that anymore. That's what I mean with culture, you know, where our culture is. It is Protestant, it is nominalistic, it is pragmatic. And all these characteristics of our culture are in every citizen somehow. Even in those who are still belong to the subcultures, like Baptists, Catholics, and so on. These subcultures have been moved out of the state into the private sphere. You can, in the private sphere, you can do, you know, if you don't attack the public law, you can do all kinds of things in there. The Muslims, 1 million in Detroit, you know, they can talk about the Sharia law at home, but if they want to take part of the Sharia law and make it into American law, they have to go through this process, you know. If they want to say honor death or so on, they would like to introduce that in the American culture, they would have to make clear to the people in the public sphere why honor death, what the purpose of it is, and who has. If they would simply say Allah wants this, it would not be enough, because the secular sphere is secular. I mean, the public sphere is secular.
It's what Habermas calls the publicly accessible reasoning.
Right.
That everyone can reason with it.
Yeah, right. So, and this is not very easy, you know, in some of those issues which those religious people have. How do you take, for instance, the usury law? If you want to a Jew, a Christian, or a Muslim, and you want to reintroduce the usury law again, even in the mild form of Catholics, let's take all interest rates down to 2.1% or whatever. You know, how do you make that clear to people in order to make it plausible and acceptable? That is the art. You know, that is why Paul comes in the Ark Park, and by saying those nice things there, he tries to make it plausible and acceptable. They have laughed, and he has to stop them laughing and saying you are a parrot or whatever, you know. Or hear the doctors saying, you know, they think, there are these bishops who think that God puts souls, you know, into those little embryos in 10 million women every year. You know, this sounds ridiculous, you know. So, or when the bishops then say, you know, you naturalists, you take the last little morality out of our youth, which they still have. So then it becomes hostile, and it doesn't lead anywhere, and then it's simply power. The secular world, the sciences, the state, they are more powerful. And the religious people will just be pushed to the private sphere, and there they can do whatever they want to. And I mean, it would be part, if the secularization goes on, they will simply push the religious groups, you know, they will not persecute them or whatever, but they push them, you know. States or whatever. So the 47% of Omni come to mind. So that would not be the ideal democracy. So nevertheless, here he talks to them now. Men of Athens, I have seen for myself how extremely scrupulous you are in all religious matters. Now we heard before that he almost vomited when he came into Athens. Because for him as a believing Jew, these were all idols, these beautiful goddesses and gods, ideal men and women in sculptures. They stood all outside of the temple. They were not in the temple. They stood outside in front of the door. And so he could see them. And they were not clothed. They were naked. So the Greek's faith came from seeing. The Jewish faith and the Christian faith comes from hearing, through the ear. And so he had not the right organ for seeing what was going on. But they were all idols for him, and he was vomiting, and now he says something nice. He says, extremely scrupulous you are in all religious matters. So this is called the captatio benevolentiae. You start out a talk by making a nice compliment to your audience in order to put them into a good mood. You will not say something nasty. So we had a teacher who came to the class and says, you are all stupid. So that is a bad thing to start out with. So therefore, and if it is entirely honest, that's another question. So the main thing is to get him on his side. Because I noticed, as I strolled around admiring your sacred monuments, he vomited. He didn't admire them at all. So Paul is a very complicated type of a guy, and we mentioned a few incidences before. He was, when he had converted, he was dragged before the Synhedrion, which was a secular religious government of the state of Israel, before it was destroyed in the year 70, and then in the year 134 under the Bar Kokhba. Bar Kokhba was a Messiah, like Jesus is called a Messiah, so he was called the Messiah. Even the greatest rabbi of that time, the Rabbi Akiba, told the Jews that this was the Messiah who had come to redeem the Jewish people. And then he was beaten by the Roman army, and they committed suicide. Hundreds of Jews committed suicide, and that was the real end of the state of Israel at that time. So nevertheless, that is in the background. And so he has dragged before the Synhedrion. That was before the year 70, of course, because after the year 70, when the Roman troops came through Lebanon and encircled the whole thing, and they also took the temple, and there something happened which the Romans did not want to happen. The Romans honored the gods of all the people. So when they went to Germania, to Gallia, to Britannia, they would take half of the gods home and would put them into the Pantheon. Pantheon, that means all the gods. And the Pantheon is still there. The building is still there. And then they put them there, and the priests would put holy smoke and everything and would sacrifice to them. Because the Romans had a religion of utility, as this is called. That means they utilized the gods so that they would protect the state. And so they wanted to make sure that all gods in the empire were helping the Roman Empire to be victorious and so on. And the problem with the Jews and the Christians was that they did not sacrifice. And when they did not sacrifice, then the gods got angry, and then they would be against the empire. And then the empire would have inflation and depressions and defeat and war. And so they blamed the Jews and then the Christians that they were responsible, that means for these defeats, because they said, first of all, it's atheism. You do not sacrifice to the gods, so the Christians were atheists. And when you were atheists, you also committed high treason. That means you didn't act against the state. not to recognize the gods meant then that the gods did not help Roman Empire. And St. Augustine still, who is the founder of the Roman Catholic paradigm, he still wrote, these books in order to defend Christians against this charge by saying the Roman Empire lost battles before there were any Christians. So don't blame them. You had, inflations and depressions and all that before when there were no Christians yet, and therefore the Christians are not responsible. As a matter of fact, the Christians pray for the emperor and for the state, and so on and so on. That was so Christianity adjusted slowly to the Roman Empire. So, nevertheless, before the Synhedrion, then the state was occupied. The high priest and all that, the kings in Galilee and Judea, they were all appointed by Rome, and they were dependent on Rome. Then what Paul did there in order to show his, not scrupulous, but his smartness or his cunning. He was a cunning type of a guy. Cunning, he said to them, they were all sitting there, and they charged him he was not allowed to preach Jesus the Christ, because the Christian sect was, and Christianity was a Jewish sect, and they prayed at home, but then they went, hi, nice to see you. They went to the temple like all the other Jews, and then they went home and they broke the bread, and they had a communistic community. They sold all the houses and the land and gave it to Peter, and then Jesus' brother Jacob took the position, and then they distributed to everybody. That means from everybody according to his ability to everybody according to his need. And we said that during the two conventions that both parties quoted that, but they forgot, first of all, that it was from the New Testament. Secondly, that Marx had made it into the basis of his communistic teaching of his historical materialism. So, but also the president had used it when he defended his progressive taxation. That means those who are more able to pay should pay more, so that the needs of the others, schools, education, and so on, could be paid for. So, okay. So, but what happened now? The Synhedrion was dissolved then. It was before the year 100 already, but the Romans allowed part of the Synhedrion to move to the city of Joppe, which is at the Mediterranean. And so the Synhedrion went on after 70, and it happened then around 100 that the Christians were excommunicated from the Jewish community. And the reason was Jesus of Nazareth. So Christianity is not a religion of the book. Judaism is a religion of the book, and Islam is a religion of the book. And Dustin knows that Islamic people very often call, the Christians a religion of the book and so on. But Christians understand themselves as a religion concentrated on this man, Jesus of Nazareth. The books are written by the church. They are written about this man, Jesus. So the whole thing is Jesus-centered. But that was before all of this. It was when the Synhedrion was still in Jerusalem, and they forbid the Christian sect. They didn't excommunicate them yet, but they forbid them to announce that Jesus had been resurrected and went up to heaven, and he preached it anyway. Paul went around everywhere, and Peter too. So they put him before the Synhedrion, and he then said, "It is because of the resurrection that I'm standing here." And he knew that the Pharisee believed it. The resurrection of the flesh is an idea which the Pharisees developed about 100 years, 200 years before Jesus, when they were attacked by Greek armies and had huge casualties. And so the question was, where do all these dead people go? Before that, there was something like an underworld, which were neither good nor bad people. It was a shadowy world where nobody wanted to go, and so on. But now it becomes a little bit different. For Jesus, he talks about the Gehenna, and the Gehenna was a garbage place south of Jerusalem, which was burning all the time. They burned the garbage there. So, but it was also a valley in Palestine where the old religions had sacrificed children to the god. So both of them were images for a cursed place. So nevertheless, the Pharisees then got this idea that the fallen people, that they would not only their souls would go up to heaven, but could be the resurrection of the body. And this is what the Christian sect took over. So that Paul said, if the Pharisaic belief of the resurrection of the dead is not true, then Jesus has not been resurrected. And if Jesus has not been resurrected, then we are the poorest devil in this world, because we get nothing out of this world and there is no other. So that was Paul's realistic assessment, and now he uses that, and he knows the Pharisees believe it because they had invented it, and the Sadducees, who were enlightened people, they participate in the Hellenistic Enlightenment. Like we, when I have my students before them, the Saudis have no bourgeois enlightenment, they have no Marxist enlightenment, they have no Freudian enlightenment. The students from Michigan have a bourgeois enlightenment, but they have no Marxist enlightenment, that was repressed, and they have only half a Freudian enlightenment because it was half repressed. So these Sadducees, that was the priests, the high priest and so on. Most of the Sanhedrin, or half of them, the others were all Sadducees, and therefore there were discussions. When Jesus discusses with the Sadducees about eternal life, they challenged that he believed in that, because Jesus was closer to the Pharisees than he was to the Sadducees. So by saying this now, he knew that the two would get at each other's beards, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and so they did. And they shouted at each other, and he was sitting there and enjoyed the whole theater. They forgot completely everything about him and just discussed the resurrection now. And after that was finished, he did even worse against them. He said, I'm not accepting your trial. I'm not accepting your jurisprudence, and he appealed to the emperor. That means he appealed to the occupation force. And then the Romans paid his trip through the Mediterranean, took 2 years to Rome, and then he was in prison in Rome, but a very loose type of a prison. So he had visitors, he had people who served him in prison and so on, so it was not very strict. And then there must have been a trial, but that is not history. And Peter also had a trial. He was executed, so the tradition goes, but he was a Roman citizen, so he could not be crucified. But Peter was crucified, but he didn't want to be crucified upright, so they crucified him upside down, because Peter thought that was Jesus, and he was not Jesus, so he wanted to be crucified the other way around. So that is the tradition, and we don't have to go any further, but just in order to characterize the man who is now standing there. So he has already years where he goes from synagogue to synagogue in order to convince the Jews first, and that we cannot call the public sphere yet. But now in Athens, he goes really to the marketplace. He did in Ephesus too, in other places too. And but he's now in the center of the Greek world for his discourse. And so, so the monuments we see, this is not dishonest, that is rhetoric. Rhetoric is an art. It is something which can be studied, and he has this rhetoric knowledge and skills. And so he starts with this cards to benevolence. He goes down before them in order to show his goodwill, in order to get them on his side, and he says some things which he is not entirely convinced of, namely about these monuments there. That you had an altar inscribed to an unknown God. So when he came through the door, there was this altar. Well, he says, the God whom I proclaim is in fact the one whom you already worship without knowing it. So there is something, when you enter the public sphere, you have to build bridges to the other people, to the non-believers, to different parties, and so on. And that is the way how he does it. He says, what I want to bring, you have it already. So in order to have a playing field for his discourse, which he wants to open up. And so we can say that we can learn from this. If we have a discussion on rape, for instance, that there are wild definitions by the FBI and by different people about this rape thing, forcible rapes and so on, forcible rape and so on. When you have a discussion, then you want to build a bridge to the other people, or we had stem cell research where you said, we all want to heal Alzheimer's, and we all say that the embryo is human. We just have that little difference. The embryo is not yet a person, and so on. So that is a good model, and that's what we want to look for. If we look to Bonhoeffer or Paul or Augustine, these can be models for a Christian or believer to enter the public sphere, which is unbelieving. And for us, what is particularly difficult, that the public sphere is full of people who have lost it. That means they have been Christians, During my birthday party, there was a wonderful colleague of mine. We founded the union, the university union there, and he came downtown recently, and he said to somebody, if all the Catholics were like Rudi Siebert, then I would not have left the church. And the other one said, if all were like Rudi Siebert, I would have left the church a long time ago. So public opinion is somewhat divided there in Kalamazoo. But nevertheless, I think this thing which Paul didn't have and which Augustine didn't have is that most of our audience are people who have left the church. So we have masses of people in Europe who leave. We have masses here. A few years ago, we were 2/3 of the American population. We are only 1/4 now. And we are still 1/4 because 12 million Catholics came from Latin America and so on, and therefore that has filled up the rows, but otherwise it would even be more. So, and these people, that is, what one has to deal with. So they are not people from other religions, some there, of course, and believers, but there are those who have been believers and had some reason to give it up, whatever that reason may have been, birth control or authoritarian regime or dogmatism in the church or whatever. There are innumerable reasons why, and one has to talk about that very differently. And the Pope has just written an encyclical, Porta Fidei, which was read on Sunday in all the churches around the world, in which he recognizes this, though the evangelization is his theme, and there is a whole rubric of re-evangelizing people who have lost it, and the number of them becomes larger and larger all the time. Okay, so now he starts out. So he has built that bridge. Now he starts out and says, since the God who made the world and everything in it is himself Lord of heaven and earth, he does not make his home in shrines made by human hands. Now here comes the criticism. Now, see, he has said these things in order to make them feel good, but now he starts the criticism. So that is also to be learned. You cannot start out with criticism. You have to see, first of all, what we have in common before you say what we have not in common. Suddenly he comes out, and this is this unbelievably dialectical mind of that Jew. And the Jewish dialectic is much sharper even than the Greek dialectics. So now he says suddenly, that this God whom he brings there and who sits already on the altar out there, that he does not need any shrines. That means he suddenly denies all the temples there. One could say, of course, that the gods were outside of the temples, but that would be a little bit sophistry. So sophistry is a bad form of dialectics. That is how a dialectics is sometimes known. Lawyers who, make the innocent guilty and the guilty innocent and so on. It's trickiness, it's entirely subjective. It is to make a subjective point and tear down any objective norm and so on. That is sometimes called dialectics too. So nevertheless, that is not what he means. He goes now, he makes the attack now, after he has been friendly and nice, and that these human hands there, these shrines which were made by human hands, are useless in terms of the God who brings down, because he does not live in temples and so on. So here it comes slowly, but it is very nice and soft still. nor is he dependent on anything that human hands can do for him. There's sacrifices. This God does not need any sacrifice. He has everything what he needs, and so on. So and can do for him, and so on. So that is echoes, of course, the whole prophets. So Paul stands in the tradition of Isaiah and Jeremiah, and who would say these gods have eyes and they cannot see, they have legs and they cannot walk. You take a piece of wood and half of it you put in the fire, the other half you make a god out of it. So that goes up to marks of commodity fetishism, right? Capitalism is commodity fetishism. That stuff, the commodities, are the works of our hands, and then we stand before them and we admire them, and then the market even gets in control of ourselves and fires us in spite of the fact that we have all degrees and so on. So that is the whole Marxist thing. Marx was a Jew, baptized Lutheran. He also stands in that same tradition. That is when his children, asked him what the music was about in the church, as I mentioned, and he would say, there was once a poor man, and the rich people murdered him, and then he said to the bourgeoisie in London, and he would say that to the bourgeoisie in Kalamazoo too, why do you make a liar out of this man, who with every word you say and with every deed you do? And you have to apply that to the discussions there. We discuss that a little bit later with the vice presidents. Both are Catholics, so how do they appear in the public sphere? So we have to connect it always with what we are doing here. So that means it is against idolatry. So he becomes critical now of the idolatry. What Marx's charge against capitalism is that it's idolatry. It is, capital is our own product, but we relate to it as if it was our master. We bow before it. It's the bottom line. We follow the bottom line. We make our laws and so on in favor of it. So, and Max Weber then repeated that. The civil society, bourgeois society, is polytheistic. Idolatry, the god is to whom you put most time and most energy. So if you have porno all the time, that would have been called Aphrodites. If you work for war and you pay billions for it, that would be called Mars, the god Mars. We don't have these names anymore, but we have the forces of idolatry. They are there. So Marx attacks the capitalist society as an idolatrous society. Paul does the same thing. It's the Decalogue. You have only one God, no other gods. That developed only slowly. So Abraham had this one God vision. His relatives made little gods. They were God makers. He is called to leave that country and so on. But it is not pure monotheism. It is henotheism, it's called. He still recognizes other gods. His wives still have kitchen gods, whom he thinks are real somehow. Only slowly the Jewish consciousness comes to the point that the other gods are not real at all, and then make fun of them. And that is a source, of course, of anti-Semitism, at least one cause. If you live between Egypt and the Euphrates and Tigris civilization, and they all have gods, and you say they have eyes and cannot see, and they have legs and cannot walk, and they are absolutely powerless, they're just your own making, and so on, then they will hate you for that. They will hate your guts for it, and so on. So that is at least one of the reasons for which goes through all societies up to the present, where then Hitler was able, to stimulate this this type of anti-Semitism, because he reminded the people of the economic activities of Jews and turned it around and said the Jews are materialistic, and the Jews have only money in their mind all the time, and so on and so on. And they have poisoned us. That is why we have become so rotten, because they got us into that with their banking business. They Rothschild, their Jewish high finance. They were responsible for 70 War and World War, and that is why they have to be annihilated. We have to get rid of the cancer, otherwise we cannot, the human species cannot survive. Okay, so you can always break in whenever you want to. So that is since he can never be in need of anything, the God, so he develops a new God concept now, which is different from the gods there. Yes?
Well, some some religious orders in the early medieval period conducted banking.
Yeah,
They
Right.
traded money
yeah.
and made profits.
Right. Well, you know, we don't say that what the anti-Semites say, that this is necessarily true. I mean, we know that the Jewish people did get into the money business very early, or into trade. So in the Middle Ages, productive people were appreciated. All merchants were looked down on because people did not know why a merchant makes money when he does not change the commodity which he has not produced.
Yeah, but you know, the Jews were not permitted also to own land at one time.
Why?
Throughout the Middle
They
Ages.
could not own land, they were put into the ghetto, they could not join the guilds, so the shoemaker guild or the baker guild and so on. They could not defend part of the wall there. The guilds had saints, they were all religious and so on. So therefore they were pushed out of production and they were pushed into circulation, as that's called. So that is concretely, the farmers came and brought their 10 little pigs there to the wall, to the door, and then the little Jew came and said, you know, okay, what does it cost, the little pig? 5 cents, you know, so I give you 10 cents or 5 cents for it, and then you can go to the inn and you can drink beer inside. Then he took the paid the 5 cents, took the pigs around the corner to the marketplace and sold them for 10 cents. And that is where then surplus value starts, where speculation starts. He took the surplus money then and gave it as a loan to the farmer for interest, and he could not take interest because of the usury laws. The Jews had usury laws, the Christians had usury laws, and the Muslims still have usury laws, so you cannot take interest, that's sinful, because if you give $100 and then you get $110 back, nobody knew where the $10 are coming from. You had not worked for the $10, somebody else had worked for it, and therefore you got it, that's robbery. So Catholics have brought it down to 2.5%. You can take interest or pay 2.5%. That is considered to be the costs for the work of the banks. So, but the irony is that the Jews were condemned for having started capitalism in spite of the fact, or not for working, first of all, not working and then become capitalists, in spite of the fact that the Christians had pushed them out of production into. So they were blamed for going into circulation, and it was the Christians who had pushed them out of production into circulation. So this in itself is a horrifying thing. And then, of course, you know, the St. Peter's Cathedral, where the Pope speaks from there, that was paid, you know, with money which was collected, indulgence money was collected, and half of it went to Rome for building the cathedral there, and the other half went to Fugger and Welser. These were banking places in Bavaria, and they were not Jewish at all. And so banks in northern Italy and in Holland, they were not Jewish at all. So when Henry Ford, the fascist here, together with Father Coughlin there, when they claimed all of Wall Street, that was Jewish. All speculative capital was Jewish, in spite of the fact that there were innumerable Aryans there as well. So when it goes badly with capitalism, then they blame the Jews, then make them into scapegoats for capitalism not working. But that is why Henry Ford wrote the published the Protocol of the Elders of Zion, a little red book, you know, which is the most furious attack against the Jews who want to have world power, and that is why he published 4 volumes against the International Jew, in which he proved step by step in all kinds of little things in Michigan and elsewhere where the Jews do the same thing, cheating all the time and so on. So, and then the Jews boycotted the tea model, which didn't go very well along the East Coast, and they forced him to abandon his anti-Semitism. He was a neutralist, like Lindbergh. He didn't want to go in the war. He wanted the Germans to let them kill the communists over there and leave their back free. And the Roosevelt administration then changed the thing, and he was forced, you know, to change his car production into the Liberator production here in Detroit, of which I shot 16 down.
But Ford had chartered a boat, a peace boat at one time.
Right, yeah, right. Well, he tried everything. He took the decorations in Berlin. He went to Berlin, got decorations from Hitler and so on. He praised Hitler all the time. And what they bound him together was this anti-Semitism, but also a whole theory. They were both Keynesians, and they both wanted to get rid of Wall Street. And so Hitler was even better than Keynes. He improved on Keynes. He solved problems which Keynes hadn't even solved yet at that time. And he was able to give 6 million Germans, he said 7 million, let's say 6 million Germans, jobs. That's 10% of the population. And Stalin took off all the Wall Street things, so all these institutions, and he had no depression at all. So if Ford would live now here in Michigan, he would have given no support to Wall Street. He would have given all the support to productive capital, those who build roads and houses and cars and locomotives and so on, but nothing to speculative capital, because they don't produce anything, Wall Street. It does have a function. It has to invest money into industries so that they can produce and then build jobs. That's Romney's theory, right? That's the theory of the neoconservatives. So it was Reagan who gave up Keynesianism and replaced it by Friedman and the Chicago School. That means no policing anymore of the market, the deregulation and privatization and so on. And that led to the catastrophe of 2008, and that is what Romney wants to repeat again. That is the argument which the president should make all the time, because obviously people have forgotten what happened between Reagan and 2008. And to repeat that again, you can put it into the future then. What would happen 2 years after Romney would be in power, the economists would come again and would say to him what they said to President Bush. But Mr. President, the economy goes over the brink. And then he would have to do the same thing what Bush did. He nationalized the banks and the industries. And Obama did not even do that to the extreme as Bush did. But he will have to do it to the very extreme, because there will be no money coming from China anymore. The Chinese said that. We should read both books of Adam Smith. That's shameful that the communists have to tell us the books which we should read. One book is about the wealth of nations. That means how you get rich. The other one is a morality book, how to curb the greed which is the idolatry of capitalism. It's the greed which has no limits or whatever. So they have to be policed if the greed does not push them into suicide. And I've just heard from Wall Street that there were friends there, relatives there, and they said, we'll not vote for Obama. He will take everything away from us for which we work too hard. I said, when the hell have you ever worked hard? Because they don't work. That's not called work. That means they are in the circulation. They are not in production, and that was never called work, really. So, but I said, no, he will have progressive taxation, so they will be taxed higher, but he's not a socialist. He is a liberal, also a liberal. He will not take anything away from them, but he will also not rescue capitalism. No, they will Romney. If you were in Venezuela now, and Ms. Chavez, who just won the election, he would like Romney. For every socialist, Romney would finish it up much faster than the Obama. Good. When you make reforms, you give a little bit more lifespan to capitalism. And therefore, whoever wants to have a little bit more capitalism, he should vote for Obama. The other one finish it up. Because one good example is George Soros, who pays my Eastern students there in Dubrovnik and in Yalta. He paid the election for Obama, but he wanted him to nationalize the banks and nationalize the industry. He, a super capitalist, a billionaire, because he knows that civil society destroys itself if it is not policed. And Obama did not fulfill that. Obama did nationalize the debts of the banks, but not the banks. So that will have to be done then, and like Bush, who was an extreme neoliberal, suddenly nationalized the banks. And Romney, an extreme neoliberal, he will have to nationalize the banks. And if he does what he said, namely to let it go, let the market decide that the banks who are too big to fail will be allowed to fail anyway, and that the car industry, which is too big to fail, will fail anyway, the unemployment will go up to 20%, and the cities will be in turmoil, And they will have to do what Roosevelt did not do and what everybody else did in Europe, namely to ask for the emergency laws, send the Congress home, and govern by edict. And you have a completely different country which will either go to fascism or it will go to socialism. Since the education is so low, it will go to fascism and not to socialism. We are not prepared for socialism, but we are prepared for fascism. And I told you my life story there that when I was young, I saw the transition from liberalism to fascism, and then I was trained here to go back to bring the German fascism over into liberalism again. So we have these three forces. There's liberalism, and liberalism gets in trouble and hits the bottom because of this, like 2008 or 1929, then socialists appear. That's why they call Obama socialist or whatever. And when this danger of socialism comes, then fascist forces, because fascism is the means of the ruling class to get the socialists under control, push them out, and restore liberalism again. That is what happens, what will happen too. So that's what we now that liberals act like fascists to urinate on dead Talibans. That is fascism. To go out at night in Afghanistan and shoot 17 people, their women and children, that is fascism. To burn the Holy Quran, that is fascism. To use waterboarding like the Holy Inquisition and like the SS, so the CIA now, that's fascism. But that liberals do fascist things does not yet mean that they are fascists. More has to happen than that. They particularly have to become much more intelligent. If we had a guy who had an IQ like Hitler, that would be a real danger. So when the American people don't want to have a super guy in the White House who has a real brain or so, but rather an average guy, that's a good instinct. Because if you really had a smart guy there, heaven knows what he could do. He could do something good, but he could do also horrible things. So that as far as the diagnosis and the prognosis, and that is an important election now, which is coming up. So, but they have formed that new word, an under-informed electorate. That's a horrible word, but it's a new one. Under-informed, that means people are not educated, that they can remember what happened from Reagan to 2008 and why it happened. And that therefore one cannot repeat it again. And that those who cannot remember will have to repeat it again. Now the numbers of Romney are too high if one thinks of this, even if he will lose or whatever. At the moment they are, that so many people cannot remember anything, that is most catastrophic as far as the present situation of the electorate is concerned. I mean, it just happened. Millions of people just lost their homes. Millions of people lost their jobs and so on. So why can't they remember what just had happened to them? Why they cannot connect the dots? That is a nice expression, to connect the dots. They cannot connect the dots because it needs certain categories like surplus value, which have been repressed, which people are not taught, and so they are unable to connect the dots, and that is why it is part of why Romney can have those numbers. They are ununderstandable, how these statistics can be that way, you know. I mean, if he would be 10 points below, that would already be catastrophic, you know, but sometimes he is even with him in numbers, and sometimes Romney is, because of that discussion, he is even a few points higher than the president. And I mean, that indicates, you know, where the consciousness of people is and what they can remember and what they can't remember anymore. Okay, let me go back to this text and to finish it up there. So it is the attack against idolatry, right? Idolatry is that means to make images of the absolute, finite images which are untrue, and also not to name the divinity in the radical sense. Because all language is finite, God is infinite. Whenever you use finite language to speak about God, that is insufficient, that is untrue. It is every name of God is blasphemy in a certain sense, because finite language never reaches the infinite. And so the prohibition of making images of the absolute or naming it is the prohibition against idolatry. And Marx's attack against capitalism is that it is idolatry. Marx was not a cataphatic believer in the cataphatic tradition, where you have a revelation, and he rejected that, and therefore he's called an atheist. But he stands in the apophatic tradition, in which God is hidden, the unknown God, the Theon Akhenaton, who is before Athens there, and stood before Athens, the altar, and so on. That is the apophatic thing. That means you cannot say anything about God.
Spell that.
Apophatic, apophatic, and the other one is cataphatic. So cataphatic means God has revealed himself. Apophatic means God has not revealed himself. Paul and the Christian tradition is both, connects both. That means he says here, I come to reveal the unknown God. So he has a revelation, but in spite of the fact that the God is revealed, he is still hidden. He is still the unknown God. He has revealed something. So Jesus would say, the Messiah will come before this generation is over. Then he says, nobody knows when the Messiah will come. Only the Father in heaven will come. So he reveals the Father in heaven, but the Father in heaven remains hidden at the same time. So you can either have the one or the other tradition, the apophatic God, which Marx had, or the cataphatic God, which those people had who say God is good, God is beautiful, and so on and so on. Then they know something. But all these attributes contradict each other. God is powerful, God is just, God is love, and so on. So then you say, why didn't he do anything about Auschwitz? Is he powerless? Some people say this, Or if he is powerful, then he should have done something about Auschwitz, and he didn't, therefore he's unjust. Or he didn't, and therefore he's without love, and so on. That is the trial in Auschwitz of the Pharisee, of the rabbis in Auschwitz. They had a trial where they put good on trial because God had broken the covenant. God promised to protect the Jews and make them prosperous and have a nice life, and so on. And in 3 days, the court decided that God was guilty. He had made the promises to Abraham, to Moses, and the covenants were not held. As a matter of fact, they thought that God had made a covenant with Hitler, and that he used Hitler in order to do to the Jews all what the Jews had done to the Egyptians when the firstborn were killed, and what they had done to the Babylonians, and so on. That all that came home to them now. So that was the trial in Auschwitz, which Wiesel was in Auschwitz, and then he wrote the story The Night, and then he remembers this and tells the story there. And then as a result, 90% of the people in Israel are non-believers, because not of the natural sciences, but because God has broken the covenant, and the God who would do that cannot be God. So this God is not. That means they've moved from a cataphatic God to an apophatic God. We don't know anything about it. We don't understand what he did in Auschwitz. It is inexplicable and so on. But some rabbis continued to pray and went on in this. And also in Israel, there is a group of rabbis, Orthodox and conservative, and also Reformed ones. So, okay, so that is the issue behind that. On the contrary, it is he who gives everything. So God does not need houses, God does not need any sacrifices. So he repeats the teaching of Jesus. He never saw Jesus, he had only that vision, and then he went to Jerusalem, and then Peter and the friends and the brothers of Jesus, some believed him, other brothers, they had 4 brothers and 2 sisters at least, and some of them believed in him, others didn't. So who those believed, they told Saul at that time, what he taught. And Jesus tells to the Samaritan woman, he talks to the Samaritans, were people who had been planted there by the Babylonians. They were not Semites, but they believed something similar. But he tells the woman, there will come a time when people pray, not in Jerusalem, nor on any other mountain, but in the Spirit will pray to God, and so on. So that is the same thing which Paul then repeats. Some things he gets from Jesus through the apostles, and other things adds to it from his Pharisee background. And he says so. He says, when that is what the Lord told me, that's what Jesus told me, and then this is what I add to it, and I have some authority too. So it is differentiated what is originally from Jesus' teaching and what he adds to it. So, nevertheless, it is the attack against idolatry, and he has hidden it when he started, but then he comes into the open now. The gods which you have here are not true. They are not real. The real God does not need buildings, and he doesn't need sacrifices, and so on. On the contrary, it is he who gives everything, including life and breath, to everyone. From one single stock, he not only created the whole human race so that they could occupy the entire earth, but he decreed how long each nation should flourish and what the boundaries of its territory should be. Now, you know, we killed the whole race here, and we enslaved the whole other race and occupied the whole territory. There is a slight contradictions between this. If God sets the boundaries of nations, we marched into Canada, to Montreal, and we were beaten. Otherwise, that would be ours too. And in Mexico, we tried the same thing. So there is, of course, a discrepancy then between what is revealed and what the historical process is. And the more people know about the historical process, the more they may doubt a certain revelation when it becomes a positive revelation. That means they move from a positive type of theology to a negative theology. So negative theology is an apophatic theology. Most people today are negative theologians. That means they say we can say what God is not, but we cannot say what he is. Okay, then, and he did this so that all nations might seek the deity and, by feeling their way toward him, succeed in finding him. Yet, in fact, he is not far from any of us. And now comes something interesting. Since it is in him that we live and move and exist. And that is a quotation from Epimenides. That means in Greek. So he does again, he says, your idolatry is wrong, but then he quotes their own authorities, their own poets. So that is something, a model which can be used. So one makes a friendly situation, one builds a bridge, but sticks to the truth. What you do here is untrue. Your buildings, your gods, and so on, it is untrue. But there were people among you who were progressive, and they knew that this was all wrong. And so he quotes this guy now here, and since it is him that we live and move and exist, as indeed some of your own writers have said, we are all his children. So there is another one, the phenomena of Aractides. These are two poets there who have said the same thing, and that is called panentheism. So the panentheistic solution of Paul does not come only from Judaism, but it comes also from the Greeks. And that is why the Pope today fights so much against de-Hellenization of religion. See, because the Reformation de-Hellenized. It cut Christianity away from the Greeks. And the bourgeois revolution, which made this country, is also de-Hellenized. And the multiculturalists today also de-Hellenize. If you de-Hellenize, you cut Christianity into pieces. That means all what remains is the little Jesus who teaches the Sermon on the Mount, which nobody can follow. That's all. It shrinks into almost nothingness. So de-Hellenization, and this is of course Hellenic now. That is Greek. That's part of the Greek Enlightenment, which transcended polytheism and came up with this panentheism. That means God one. All is one. The Meister Eckhart, one of the greatest theologians of the West, who influenced historical idealism, the whole German idealism, and Emerson here, and Thoreau, and so on, were influenced by him, and Marx was influenced by him. The whole historical materialism, one of the most productive thinkers ever, and you know what they have done to him? They have excommunicated him. 700 years ago, he was attacked because of his panentheism. They called it pantheism. Then he made it clear in a defense writing that it was not pantheism, but it was panentheism. And then they said it's okay. When he died and couldn't defend himself anymore, the Inquisition attacked him again.
Who was this again?
Meister Eckhart, Eckhart, yeah. And this Meister Eckhart is one of the greatest theological accomplishments ever. I recommend to you to read him under all circumstances. People are always so hateful against theology, and they have no idea what it is. So if one wants to be against theology, one should at least read one. And if one cannot read Eckhart, then one should read Karl Barth or Karl Orner, and so that one at least knows what one fights against. So they fight against bin Laden, or because and have never read anything of him. And so that is another thing about this uninformed type of an electorate. They play golf all the time instead of sitting on their ass and for once do something. You know, at least if they want to say something, then at least they have a basis to do. When people fight theology, they should have at least encountered one. And Master Eckhart is the greatest one, and that for 700 years the church was not able to take him back. A Dominican, a beautiful Dominican priest and a high-ranking Dominican fellow authority in Thuringia, the same area where Luther was born. And so it would be time, you know, that they finally get as slow thinkers after 700 years can see the difference between pantheism, which is behind Hinduism and Taoism, and that they are all pantheistic, and panentheism. Pantheism means God and nature are one. Eckhart never said this. Panentheism means God and all. That means all is in God, not outside. If it was outside of God, then God would be finite, and that would be idolatry. So therefore, the one, all is in one. The one created all in himself. That is panentheism. So this little word is it what keeps Eckhart still excommunicated, but nobody cared about it. So Spinoza was influenced by it. Even Ignatius of Loyola, the Jesuit, the founder, was influenced by him. Merton, the Trappist, was influenced by him. And so the Catholics don't just care what Rome does anymore, which is a very sad story. Pope can say whatever they want to. When Hans Küng was here, the bishop here wrote to everybody not to go to Hans Küng's sermons, speeches, and so on. Of course, everybody came. As a matter of fact, it's a wonderful piece of propaganda if the church condemns somebody. So, but it should be made straight. So they should look at the man once more. And I recommended that in the book recently, that they would, you know, that it's called now the Congregation for the Preservation of Faith. That's the new name, I think, of the old Inquisition. That they should, you know, look through the papers once more and open up the trial once more if they want to, and finally get the idea. You know. It happened against Galileo, it happened against Darwin, it happened against Freud. Always suddenly they have to say, well, yeah, maybe they were right anyway. Slow thinkers. So, but that's a little bit long now. 700 years is a little bit long. So they should bring the Dominican home, so to speak. Okay, so that is our point today. So far we want to go because we just want to see how a Christian is operating in the public sphere. So.